Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 11th webinar series that we have at the Center for Professional Selling. It is an absolute pleasure for me to welcome Mr. Kevin Allen, who is the creator of a very, very cool game right now called EI Games, not to be mistaken with EA Games. But again, probably this will give you much more knowledge and insights into being successful in business. So, Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Indeed. Kevin, actually, before we start diving into EI, you had wonderful positions. You actually worked with people from Burberry and the current vice president of retail for Apple, Angela Ahrendts. So tell us a little bit more about yourself and how did you find yourself creating a game called Emotional Intelligence Games?
Well, I certainly, if someone asked me when I was a kid what I wanted to do when I grew up, it certainly wouldn't have been to be in the advertising business or create an EI game. But I would say that it's apropos that as a kid, and even as a young adult coming up in the business, I was a highly sensitive child and a highly emotive child. And quite candidly, when I started getting into the business world and growing up in the business world, I frankly thought that quality of being sensitive or emotive was a disaster, that it was the worst possible thing you could be. And little did I know that later in my career, it would be the single greatest asset that any person can have in business. And of course, we all now know, now I didn't know what emotional intelligence was. All I knew is if I walked into a room full of people, I call it my smeller. I could sort of go, I know what's going on here. And somehow this awareness of people's emotions and feelings. And of course, we all know from Coleman and Caruso and others that it is skill for the 21st century. But I was a lucky person that I eventually found myself in the advertising business, eventually working for places like McCann Erickson. If you know the Priceless campaign for MasterCard, that's how you would know me. Although I didn't write it, my mother would say I wrote it. I didn't. But I am the guy that put the team together for it. And of course, even in the advertising sphere, it wasn't based upon a piece of plastic. It was based upon an emotional relationship with a customer. And then once I left the business, I started doing training, and that's where I met Angela in the area of emotional intelligence selling, because really, I was a pitch guy, which is why I'm so delighted to be talking about how emotional intelligence is a key part of the process of selling and influencing. And eventually, Angela challenged me to say, you need to bottle this, which you do. And that gave rise to the emotional intelligence game simulations.
It's fantastic. So one of the things you talk about, of course, is that you were in the pitch world. And since the audience that we're trying to talk to here is mostly salespeople, but I hear the term pitch, and I hear entrepreneurs talk about pitch. I hear advertising talk about pitch. But essentially what they're saying is they're selling, but they don't like the term sales. So for me, that's one of the things which is very interesting. So from that viewpoint, so my key takeaway when I actually saw your talk, which by the way was something that I was really influenced by as well, is emotional intelligence is such a critical part in so many things that we do, not just professionally, but also personally. Yeah. Now, to what extent did emotional intelligence actually help you in your job? Because I'm assuming that eventually what you did in practice is what you then bottled it up afterwards. So can you give a little bit more insight into that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of my old bosses said to me when talking about relationships inside the company, inside business, he said, son, if you want a friend, buy a dog. At the end, at the end of the day, our positions in business, if you take so my position essentially as a salesman, we called it business development. It's the same thing. So my objective is for my customer or my existing client to say yes to me and to accept the proposal that I've put forward. Now, I never ever saw selling as a twisting of the arm, as persuading. And of course, the same thing is true if I want to get my finance guy inside the company to say yes to my proposal. If I want people to follow me and say, I'll join your team, the conditions are all the same and the process is all the same. And probably the best example I could give, when I was writing the book, I called my mom and I said, Mom, do you know anybody that sold something door to door? Just picture that, sort of, yes. And then within 20 minutes, they write you a check. I mean, How on earth does that happen? To me, that's the ultimate litmus test of selling. And she said, yes, there's a lady that she used to know. And I remember her. Her name was Enid Merrin. And she sold World Book Encyclopedia door to door, right? So imagine this is the top saleswoman at the time. And I rang her and I asked her, Enid, how on earth did you do this? And she said, it's very simple. A mother doesn't want a set of encyclopedias. She wants her kid to be president. Hmm. Now, at the root of this is, I think, at the root of selling and influencing, which is this whole process is the ability to connect with the real emotional motivation of your audience. So if you're selling a car, does a person really want a car? Yes, they want the utility of a car. That's not what they're buying. You know, MasterCard wasn't buying an advertising agency, I can promise you. They weren't buying a campaign. They were buying was a group of people who could defeat Visa. That's the emotional motivation. So I've always made, now obviously you not only have to understand that, but then you have to connect yourself to it.
Absolutely, yeah. Which is very interesting, because one of the things which many people forget is they talk about emotional intelligence as is trying to understand the emotional aspect of your customer, but they forget that it's also how you also control your emotions in line with the person in front of you. So how critical is that, and how can an individual try to control that to make sure that they're in control of that particular conversation with the customer?
I love this area, you know, whether it's a term called self-awareness or, I mean, I like to think that it's an ability to be adaptable. And a little bit of profiling is involved here too. So let's assume for the moment, in fact, it happened just last week. I had 2 different customers for the game. One was a lady, and of course, by the way, preparation is everything. And it's not simply looking to say, okay, what is their business and is their business going up or down? It's understanding that you're not selling to a company, you're selling to a person. So the first person, person A, I looked at her LinkedIn profile, I found a speech by her. She was on a panel where she talked about that learning development is the spear point of a corporate transformation. Okay. So obviously, when I go onto that call, by being adaptable and self-aware, I'm not going to talk about analytics, and I'm going to try to connect with what she cares about and show how what we do is indeed one of the best tools to help her in her quest for corporate transformation. So within 30 seconds of that call, she was like, she said to me, where have you been all my life, is what she said. Indeed. Contrast that to another call in the very same week. And all I could know of the CEO of the company, just talking about the company. But I looked at that and I thought to myself, clearly, analytic and sort of critical thinking is what seems to drive this guy. So I'm not going to get on that call with him and get all emotive. And in fact, what I told him at the beginning was, you know, one of the things that drives what we do is our data analytic backbone to our games. And he was like, what did you say? So I think you're right. I think it's not only to understand the emotional motivation of the profile, but how do you address that? And it's not being false. It's like if I got on the phone call with someone from Germany, and instead of saying, I love you, I said, ich liebe dich. I said the same thing, but I found a means where they could connect with me more effectively.
I think it's great that you talk about this, is because increasingly in our world, so my previous webinar was actually talking about how you have, last 3 webinars actually was talking about the basics of inside sales. That is actually how can you get a bunch of people sitting and calling, or through this medium, through technology. And the question then becomes, how critical is emotional intelligence when there's no body language involved? Or of course, the fact is that you always assume that emotional intelligence is based on what you hear from the other person, but you can also hear the other person over the phone.
Yes.
I remember once talking to people when they were saying that even when you're on the phone training call center people, that you need to be smiling on the phone because the person on the other side.
That's wonderful.
So my question is, how do you reconcile these advances in technology in how we have to understand and navigate the world of emotional intelligence?
Well, I think your operative statement, which I just loved, is this anecdote of smiling through the phone.
Yeah.
And in that regard, because one of the questions one of my clients asked me, they have call centers, and a lot of their salespeople, because they're selling technological product, they never meet the customer.
Yeah.
Sometimes they do on a call like this, but a lot of times they're on that awful speakerphone, in the middle of the desk. So I thought and I thought and I thought, and I thought to myself, well, somebody clearly has made a living doing this. I thought, radio announcer. So a friend of mine who used to be a radio announcer on the New York Times radio station. So I called him and I said, listen, you've had this huge following, millions of people used to tune into how did you do it? He said, well, I realized that they couldn't see me, but they had to feel me. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I had to make sure that the language that I used was richer, that I had to make a mental picture that while I was talking to a microphone, I was really talking to a human. He said one of the problems, or one of the effects of talking into a microphone or whatever, is because you don't have a person, you yourself become more mechanical. So we've all been on these phone calls, and then the first item on the agenda is, and always remember, one of my partner, for example, is a filmmaker. And when I'm recording, he said, look into the lens, but imagine there is a person in that lens and I'll tell you, it makes all the difference in the world.
That's interesting, because essentially what you're talking about, I'm a big fan of Lord of the Rings. Sorry, I had to bring it in. You said you had to look at the screen. And I'm thinking, isn't it amazing that actors who actually do these kind of parts in front of like a green screen or things like that? So essentially what you're saying is that a lot of these people who, if you want to be successful in understanding how to emotionally connect with the audience, especially when you're dealing with technology, that maybe a certain bit of acting skills and voice modulation could go a huge way in terms of trying to connect emotionally with the audience. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Well, I think, yes, I think two things. One is, and I'm going to come on to this in a little more detail, is you have to care, first of all. But I think back to that point, I think that there is a tendency, if you're with someone like we're doing now, we're kind of excited about what we're talking about, and yet we're on a machine, we're not in the room. But when you lose that piece, which is why I always recommend to anybody selling, get the person on a video if you can't get them. I mean, it's not that hard. And all my clients now, all my prospects, I can't think of one that hasn't agreed to going on. You just have to ask. As my mom used to say, if you don't ask, you don't get.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yes, I absolutely believe that it's the kind of training we used to get in good speaking and acting classes, which is as you said, modulation. I mean, you can speak like this, and it's very good to be here, and thank you. Or you can speak like this, and so, makes a difference. It's more emotive by nature.
Absolutely. Kevin, now actually slightly switching, because one of the things it triggered me, and I know that we were supposed to talk about certain things, but what you said triggered me a lot more. Let us say, for example, in your experience, when you're being in a room, so it's great to talk about emotional intelligence when you're talking to one person. Yeah. Now, if, for example, you go into one of those, I'm sure in one of the pitches that you did, there were multiple people sitting opposite.
Yeah.
And let's also not forget that you might have also had loose cannons on your side of the table as well. Yeah. Now, how do you control the conversation? How do you see what I mean? How can we use emotional intelligence to not just control the people in front of you, but also in your team?
Yeah. Well, I think the couple of things, and assuming, because there was a little glitch in the thing that you're talking about multiple people in the room, yeah?
Exactly, from both perspectives. So one is on the customer side, but sometimes we also end up taking people from our own organization, and you have no clue if they are emotionally intelligent to be dealing with the people on the other side.
That's a good point. So I'm going to divide this question into two pieces. Let me start with the people from their side.
Yeah.
There's some people will ask me sometimes, I get really nervous when I go to my presentation, my sales presentation. And what I say to them is, now, of course, you can't memorize the whole presentation, but one of the things that's really important is a great opening. And I'm going to come on to, I'm going to move into this via the opening. And the opening is a summary of everything you believe that you want the prospect to know. And inevitably, people look in the room, oh, it's really nice to be here. I'm like, no, don't say that. You know, it is our undying belief that learning and development is an essential cornerstone of corporate transformation. Wow, now that's an opening. Now, here's the thing. What I counsel people to do is, in a room for multiple people, find the receptive person. Now, the only way you can do that, the old expression, the eyes are the windows to the soul. Find that receptive person and deliver your opener to that person. Now, what will happen? Now, how do you know they're receptive? Just as you said, David, the body language. They're like, it's almost as if the thought bubble is going, wow, you're great. I can't wait to hear from you. And when you deliver that opener, they're going to give you the same nonverbal positive feedback. But then, to your point, as I call it, the 5-second eye burst, you move between the room, making a short emotional visit with each person in the room. And with the beauty of that, I remember I was recently at Google, I guess a couple of weeks ago, and I kept looking back and I could see this one person non-verbally, his thought bubble was, I don't agree with you. And finally I turned and I said, how am I doing? And he said, no, you're doing great. He says, I just don't think everybody has this emotional intelligent ability. And I went, oh, now. And then, of course, I was able to convince him that actually everybody does. Now, conversely, on my side, you know, like they say when you're buying property, location, location, location. As a sales guy, I say, rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. And casting. So if I know that there's a certain emotional and profile composition of the team, of the client that I'm going to pitch or present to, then so let's take the two people I presented to last week. If I'm going to go to see the lady who is more emotive and more thinking about learning and development as corporate transformation, then I'm going to take people who are like her. Mind you, if I took the same group to see the gentleman who was more analytic, he wouldn't hire us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because he wouldn't. Now, I always believe in a good mix, because obviously, if we're going to meet multiple people, you never know who's going to show up. So it's good to have a mixture. But that casting decision is very important. We used to have two creative directors when I was at McCann Erickson. Nina, who was extremely emotive and very, very warm and engaging. And Jonathan, who was very serious-minded. And I knew exactly when to bring Nina and when to bring Jonathan.
I love this. So essentially, you're putting more and more acting into it. You're talking about how to emote, how to talk into a screen, especially if you're looking at different things. Yeah. But actually, so emotional intelligence goes beyond just convincing a customer, right? Because you could also have internal customers. You could also go back. And in sales, the adage is that it's almost easy to sell to a customer than sell internally to your colleagues internally in terms of value delivery. To what extent do you think emotional intelligence also plays a far more important critical role internally to get buy-in?
Oh my goodness. You know, probably the biggest thing, if I did anything in my career, I did a lot of things, not the least of which was at the center of corporate turnaround. I mean, McCann Erickson was a turnaround, Interpublic was a turnaround, as was the last company, Lowe. And it's vitally important. And applying emotional intelligence in that circumstance, what I realized is that the internal audience breaks down into 4 groups: catalysts, observers, followers, and resistors. And I realized that based upon their emotional state, so I knew the catalyst. Yes, great, terrific. I mean, they almost raised their hand at the beginning. But while they're doing that, the follower, who's kind of a catalyst but not confident enough, they're just going to like, well, this is pretty good, but I'm going to lay back here a little bit. The observer, they're going to go like, I don't care what happens. I'm just going to make sure that whatever way the wind blows.
Indeed.
But the most important sort of, shall we say, counterpart to the catalyst is the resistor. No, we did that before. We tried that before. Oh, I've seen guys like you come and go and blah, blah, blah. Now they come in 2 flavors. The resistor who resists because they're fearful. I really don't believe, and I think they are the 90% of resistors. And then there's the other small percentage who, whatever change or whatever you're trying to sell is going to break up a good thing for them, in which case they're going to resist you no matter what. But when I'm in a corporate transformation environment or bringing my internal audience along, I'm going to target the catalyst and resistor at the same time.
Yeah.
Frankly, resistors terrify me because I'm like one of these kids that wants everybody to get along. But boy, when they know that you're listening to them, they believe they're being heard.
Indeed. I love this because I think that for me, when you're talking about it, I was actually nodding my head. And even though you talked about change management there, but personally for me, I take it as a leader or any person or any salesperson. You don't have to be a leader. If you want to get your job done, you're leading that sales process or the value delivery process. Yeah. Is you need to have that emotional intelligence to spot the kind of people and what they're looking at and what they're terrified about. For a catalyst, the way you would bring your message is going to be completely different as against the way you would focus on the followers or the resistors. And I think that's for me that's where emotional intelligence comes into play. And my takeaway from that is, as much if you're a sales manager, you could use the same thing when you're talking about setting team goals. If I'm a salesperson, I could use the same thing when I'm talking about going out there and trying to persuade people within my organization. And as a sales director or a VP of sales, I can use the same to understand when we're going to change our course and direction, that we need to also identify these are the people and how can I use what I can from my emotional intelligence toolkit to bring the right kind of messaging. And I think that's one of the things, which actually brings me, in the limited time that we have, to one of my last questions, which is very, very relevant. Tell us about this concept of EI games. I know that Angela Ahrendts asked you to bottle it up, so which means that you bottled it, and I've actually had a chance to take a look at it. It looks fantastic. But tell me a little bit more about how the concepts that you talk about reflects in the game itself.
Well, the idea of there really are EI games is kind of a confluence of two things. One is that our belief in the need to provide instruction and content in delivering emotional intelligent business skills, be they leadership or sales or business ethics or entrepreneurship, all of those skills. But that's married with a recognition that we live in the 21st century where generations of people have grown up digitally. And more importantly, that learning needs to evolve with an evolving constituency. I mean, let's face it, the word lecture, which is effectively Latin to read, is 5,000 years old. So it seems to me it was time for a little change. Now, the beauty of the game is it places the player or the student in the position of being one of these people, like being a chief executive. Mm-hmm. And the game is based upon not the right or wrong decision, but in all of these 35 situations that the game unfolds, it's whether you apply the emotional intelligence decision in that moment. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, you win points for that, and eventually you turn the company around. And they're all different games about you're the head of a firm that's introducing a new drug product to the marketplace, and you're going to be faced with all these dilemmas. Or even the entrepreneurship game, as wonderful Dr. Tringle from your organization said, wow, Kevin, I've realized that this is an emotional intelligent approach to entrepreneurship. So we're very, very excited about them. The feedback is wonderful. And there's no reason why a person can't enjoy and be engaged while they learn.
Indeed. And for me, that was the one thing which I thought was pretty interesting. I know that we were mostly focusing on a younger audience for this game, but the learnings from it could also be for a bunch of people who are not being trained in certain aspects to try and apply emotional intelligence in a fun, easy way. More importantly, rather than the typical lecture, as you said. So essentially, I'm really looking for, I know that in the interest of time that we might have to shorten this conversation at this point in time. But I think, Kevin, I think it is wonderful talking to you right now, but also in continuation of your presentation before. And I hope that you will be a friend of this webinar series. I know that you have some really other cool concepts. One of the things which I want to address, if you have the time later on, would be something on brand citizenship behavior. I think it is increasing. It's incredibly important today when there's not too much kind of adherence to brands kind of stuff, but still brands play an important role in risk mitigation. So I would really like to touch base on that. But again, I wish you all the best with your AI games. I'm looking forward to also running it with my audiences. And thank you so much for your time. And hopefully we can stay in touch.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure. I'll be back anytime. All you need to do is say yes.
Thank you so much. So that's it, folks. This is, again, we would like to thank Kevin Allen. There'll be more information about EI Games, as well as more information about Professor Allen as well. And so, again, thank you for tuning in.